about is that you have a test a week from today. It'll be fine. I know you studied.
Like everything though? Like how long you go through?
What?
Brain and spinal cord?
You did brain, you did spinal cord. We'll finish the nerves today, and we'll do heart today and Thursday. Heart is easy.
Oh, heart's in there too.
Huh? Yeah. I mean, heart's easy, guys. It's like the shortest lab, the easiest, the most retention for it. And I don't know about blood yet. We'll have to figure it out. Figure out whether I want to do a little at-home assignment for blood. Because if I lose anything in the semester, it's always blood. Because I'm like, yeah, and there's some blood. Yeah, that's probably important. Yeah, sometimes you have to lose something. So that is a week from today, and it covers. Let's see. It's supposed to cover brain, spinal cord, nerves, autonomic nervous system, heart, and maybe blood. Okay? Yeah, maybe blood. Okay? But you studied that the whole time, didn't you? During spring break, didn't you study all of that during spring break? No, you didn't? What? Huh? Yeah, non-stop studying. Well, now spring break is over, right? Okay, so we're going to finish this set of notes, and then we'll start heart today, and we'll finish heart on Thursday, and you'll have a test on Tuesday. Okay, I was going to give you guys an in-class quiz on Thursday, but I think it would probably benefit you more if I gave you a really long at-home quiz for the weekend. Don't you think?
I like those.
Okay, I'll do a long at-home quiz for the weekend that'll cover a bunch of stuff, right? A lot of this stuff that you haven't been tested over before. Does that make sense? Okay, all right, so I think that here's where we were. We went through the cervical plexus and the hard brachial plexus that has the most nerves that you have to learn and the most muscle innervation, right? Okay, that makes sense? So I've got cervical plexus and brachial plexus. Somebody remind me, if you were looking at an image right here, how would you, for instance, not be able to identify the nerves out of the brachial plexus in that picture? Because I told you I wouldn't ask that way. But how would you be able to identify that that was the brachial plexus, even if these numbers weren't here? What? First rib, yeah, right? So cervical plexus, you'd see the atlas and the axis. The brachial plexus, you'd see the first rib, right? That makes sense? And then we move down to the thoracic region right here, right? And the thoracic region doesn't form a plexus at all, right? They just run relatively parallel to one another. Does that sound familiar? So it doesn't form a plexus. And primarily what you form from the brachial plexus is what we call the intercostal nerves, right? And not surprisingly, the intercostal nerves innervate the intercostal muscles, right? So the intercostal muscles help with lifting your ribs for inspiration, squishing your ribs for expiration. So they help with breathing. I mean, it's not innervating the diaphragm because we know where that one came from, right? But these help with breathing. And then as far as sensory function from the intercostal nerves, primarily the skin that's like right here, right? So they primarily do that. They also do a little bit of the pleural cavity. So in and out, and also sensation here. So the motor activity is in and out with the ribs, and the sensations here. Is that good? Okay. All right. All right. So now we are ready to move to the lumbar plexus. And the lumbar plexus, how can you identify it? Well, every other one has a landmark, right? So you're not seeing the first rib. You're not seeing the atlas and the axis. You're not seeing the sacrum, right? So the lumbar plexus is the other one, okay? So the lumbar plexus, by the way, some textbooks now, and I think it's starting to happen more and more frequently, actually call the lumbar and sacral plexus the lumbosacral plexus, and they stick it together. And why do they do that? Because look, the lumbar plexus comes from L1 through sometimes L5, but look where the sacral plexus comes. L4 all the way through S4. Does that make sense to you guys? So sometimes they actually lump them together. There's a little bit of important difference, and that is this, okay? So the lumbar plexus comes primarily from L1 through L5, and here's what it does. It comes out here, and it goes anterior, right? Does that make sense? It goes down the anterior surface of the leg, okay? But look at what the sacral plexus does. It comes out here, and it goes posterior. Does that make sense? Okay? So the lumbar plexus primarily dives this way, and the sacral plexus primarily dives that way, even though there's overlap with where the nerves come out. Is that good? Okay, so with the lumbar plexus, So it comes out L1 through L5. So it's a little difficult to see where it's actually coming out of the spinal cord unless you take everything out of the abdomen and the pelvic cavity. So a lot of times you're going to identify it right down here instead of up there as it comes out. We do have one cadaver that's dissected all the way up to the spinal cord. So you only have to know 2 nerves out of the lumbar plexus. There's way more of them, but you have to know 2 nerves out of the lumbar plexus. The first one is the femoral nerve, and the femoral nerve is really easy because it's this big honker right here that goes and innervates mostly the anterior thigh. Yeah? It has a bunch of little branches. I'm sure you're not surprised that every damn one of those branches has a name, but that is not what you're doing with your life right now. Okay? So if it is going to the anterior thigh, I promise you that for your purposes, it's one of the branches of the femoral nerve. Does that make sense? Okay, so, and the femoral nerve innervates 8 of the anterior thigh muscles, right? And all of the vastuses, okay, the rectus femoris, so the entire quad group, right? That shouldn't be surprising for you, okay? And then the iliopsoas group, the iliacus and the psoas major, and then the sartorius, right, that goes anterior to medial, right? And then the pectineus as well. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the sensory function is, of this one, the anterior and the medial thigh all the way down the leg to the arch of the foot, right? So what does it do and where does it feel? So to be over simplistic, kind of what it does is this and this, right? Because that's what these anterior thigh muscles do. And what does it feel all the way down here? Does that make sense? Okay. Good. Okay. So, and then we have the obturator nerve. And the obturator nerve is named for the hole that it goes through, which is obturator foramen. And the obturator foramen is more medial than the stuff that you're looking at. Do you see it right here? So does it surprise you that this nerve innervates structures that are more medial than the femoral nerve does, right? And it's not much. So the obturator nerve innervates the adductor longus, brevis, and magnus, the gracilis, right? And then sometimes it helps to innervate the pectineus. Not always, but in some people, there's a branch that actually goes to the pectineus, okay? Okay, so 5 of the medial thigh muscles. So what does it do? It does this, right? Adduction. And where does it feel? All the way up here, right? So if somebody actually activates the sensory function of your obturator nerve, they better have gotten a hell yes and a high five, right? Otherwise they're going to get elbowed in the face, right? That makes sense? So even if somebody activates the sensory function of my femoral nerve, right, they better have known that that was a yes, right? But if they're all the way up here, they sure as hell better know. I better have written them a consent. Okay, so that's the obturator nerve. Everybody good? Okay, the gluteal nerves. These are hard to find. Do you guys remember where you found these on the cadaver? How you found them? Anybody remember? Yeah, you have to, kind of like looking for the medial and lateral pectorals, so you have to lift up the pec major. In order to find the gluteal nerves, the superior and inferior ones, you have to lift up the gluteus maximus. Does that make sense? Okay, so you have to lift up. And they're really, really easy to damage, which is the opportunity for me to tell you guys that I know that you're smarter than past students, but what past students have done is if there is a nerve that's difficult or small, sometimes they damage it so that they think they won't be asked it. You're going to be asked the broken one if you do that, right? So never damage anything on accident. People do it all the damn time. It's really stupid because either we will ask you the damaged one or we'll just super glue that little bastard back together. That's all we'll do, right? So you lift up the gluteus and then you can find the superior and inferior gluteal nerves. They're not that hard to find if you know what you're looking for because they actually run on either side of a muscle. Do you see this one? This is the superior gluteal nerve. Okay, right here. And this one's the inferior gluteal nerve. And between the two of them, on most people, runs what muscle? The piriformis, right? So you can use that as your identifier. Superior is on top of it, and the inferior is on bottom of it. Okay? Did you have a question?
No, sorry, I was
Oh,
moving my arm.
okay. That's the superior and inferior. So what do those do? Let's talk about what they do. The superior does the medius and the minimus, and the inferior does the maximus. Good? Okay. And neither one of them have any sensory function. Okay? Of course you have sensory function in your butt, but it ain't done by nerves that you learned. Okay? Good? Okay. Okay, so let me explain this, the sciatic nerve to you guys, because it's confusing as hell for a lot of people. So here's the deal with the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve, of course, comes out of the sacral plexus, right? And it runs down the back of the leg, and it's so freaking huge. If you can't find it, you should definitely fail. You should, right? Because it's like right there, okay? It's huge. You're going to look for it on the back side, right? Not because it comes out of the back, but because it comes out and then goes behind the os coxae, right? That makes sense? So it's huge. But what it actually is just two nerves that are actually packaged together. So let me show you what I mean. That's why it does things that are counterintuitive. So I want to explain this to you so it's likely to make a little bit more sense. There's actually two divisions of the sciatic nerve, and as they go by the back of the leg, they actually innervate different things. So the sciatic nerve is really just the common fibular and the tibial nerve packaged together in the same connective tissue, okay? So that can help you understand some things that seem counterintuitive. So let's talk about them. Does the sciatic nerve itself actually innervate anything? No, because the two nerves that actually make it up will innervate the things, right? So the sciatic nerve doesn't actually have any innervation that you talk about as the sciatic nerve. But you have the tibial nerve and the common fibular, okay? And they are color-coded right here, right? But let's look at them on this side. Okay, so as you are going down the back of the thigh, what I want you to understand is that the tibial nerve will give rise and innervate some stuff as you go down the back of the thigh, and the common fibular will innervate some stuff, right? But it's not actually considered the sciatic nerve innervating it. So let me show you what I'm talking about. You ready? Okay, so the tibial nerve, as it goes by the back of the thigh, which is where it goes, it innervates most of the posterior thigh, 4 of the posterior thigh muscles. Then it innervates most of the posterior leg muscles, 5 posterior leg muscles. And then it also innervates the motor function of the plantar surface of the foot, which is muscles you didn't learn, right? Okay. And then its sensory function is the plantar surface of the foot and the heel, right? So all the way down the bottom. So what we are going to do as we actually learn the tibial nerve is posterior thigh muscles and posterior leg muscles. So what does it do? It does this and this, right? And where does it feel? It feels here. Good? Okay? Okay. So what muscles are we talking about? Biceps femoris, the long head. Membranosus tendinosus, part of the adductor magnus. Flexor digitorum longus, gastrocnemius, soleus, and tibialis. Posterior, but not anterior. Okay? Because it's really doing the entire back of the thigh and the leg. Everybody okay with that? So that is the tibial nerve, right? And it's not called tibial when it's up here, which is why it's confusing to people that it's actually innervating things. But it's actually the tibial branch of the sciatic nerve that innervates these as it goes by it. Does that make sense? Okay, and you don't have to tell me that. I'm just trying to make it make sense to you. That you don't label the tibial nerve until you get down here. But then somebody is telling you that it does the biceps. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm not trying to tell you you have to label it up there. Just trying to tell you how it actually does those muscles. Okay, and then the common fibular nerve. So the other branch, by the way, is the common fibular right here. And so as you go down, one branch was the tibial and the other branch is the common fibular, and it's going to give rise right out here. It's not all labeled in this picture. But the common fibular nerve, anytime anything is named common, it means it's going to branch. Usually into internal and external or superficial and deep or something. Okay, so as the common fibular, it's going to go down the backside, right? And it's going to innervate what was left of the posterior thigh, which is really just the other head of the biceps femoris. Okay? Does that make sense? So the short head of the biceps femoris. Yeah? What did somebody ask?
So anything that's common fibular or just common?
Common anything. So and next week when you guys do vessels and lab, you're going to run into the common carotid, which is going to split into the internal and the external. You're going to run into the common iliac, which is going to split into the internal and the external. You're going to run into a common hepatic, which is going to have 4 branches off of it. So anytime you run into a common something, it's like this is the portion right before the branch, and it's going to branch after that. Does that make sense? Okay. So the common fibular, as it goes by the thigh, is going to innervate what was left of the posterior thigh, which was just that other head of the biceps femoris, right? Everybody good? Okay, and then of course you're actually going to label it as common fibular as it goes back here, right? But then the common fibular is going to branch, and it's going to branch into the superficial and deep fibular, right? And they're actually, for whatever the hell reason, not labeled on here. I don't know why they didn't label on this picture. The deep fibular nerve goes anterior, and it innervates the tibialis anterior, the extensor hallucis longus, and the extensor digitorum longus. Does that make sense? Okay, so it goes anterior. And its sensory function is weird as hell. Only that little space between your first two toes where your flip-flops irritate the crap out of you, that is that nerve, the deep fibular nerve, right? If you have bad, cheap-ass flip-flops that you got for $1 at Old Navy, they're definitely going to irritate the hell out of your feet, right? But if you're a mom, you bought 7 pairs because you know those kids are going to lose them anyway. Okay, everybody good? Okay, so the sensory function of the anterior leg muscles, what do those do? I don't know. Those do dorsiflexion, right? And then you feel right there. Good? Okay, that's just an oversimplification. And then the superficial fibular nerve goes on the lateral leg and does the two fibularis muscles, longus and brevis. And then the sensory function is the distal portion of the anterior leg and the dorsal surface of the foot, so right here, right? So which one did the plantar surface of the foot? Do you remember? The tibial nerve, right? Plantar surface of the foot is the tibial nerve, and the dorsal surface of the foot is the superficial fibular nerve. Everybody okay? Okay, and then I put this one on here because it's important as hell. And it's really hard to find, of course, on cadavers. It's a tiny little nerve. It's right here. It loops in, right? But there is no arguing its importance. So what does the pudendal nerve do for you? First off, it innervates the muscles of the perineum, including your sphincters, that keep you from peeing yourself and pooping yourself. Thank you, sphincters. We're really happy that those work, right? But it also innervates the external genitalia, including the penis and the clitoris. And I would argue that this freaking nerve right here is why we have freaking pollution, overpopulation. The whole damn thing is the fault of this nerve right there. So if you leave anatomy not knowing the pudendal nerve, I will not feel like I did my civic duty, okay? Okay, so that's a pudendal nerve. And yes, of course, it's hard to find on the cadaver. We don't have it dissected out, but conceptually, you definitely need to know what it is, okay? And the penis and the clitoris are the same structure, so they innervate both of them. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is autonomic nervous system, but not because you do it in lab, because you don't. It's because it's really important for phys. So I need to give you guys some background about the autonomic nervous system that hopefully you will hold on to well enough to understand the terminology when you get to phys, okay? We don't study these structures in the anatomy lab, mostly because in order to see autonomic structures, I would have to destroy an entire cadaver, right? You wouldn't be able to see any of the musculature. I would have to take everything out of the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavity. So that's why we don't have you learn these anatomical structures in lab, just because it's really too costly. It costs me an entire cadaver to do it. We do have one cadaver in which you can see a couple of them, but we don't ask them in lab. Okay, so I want to go back to the autonomic nervous system and revisit it, and we don't do this in a ton of detail. I just have to give you enough to hold on to so that when you get to phys, you'll be able to like go, oh, okay, I remember that exists. So before we get into this, let me ask you a couple of questions and see if you can remember terminology. When I say autonomic nervous system, am I talking about CNS or PNS? PNS, the peripheral nervous system. It's part of the PNS. And is it sensory or motor? Motor. Do you remember what the effectors are for the autonomic nervous system? Effectors. The effectors are the things that it controls. Yeah, you're starting to get it. I hear some of it. Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, right? Okay, so I want to talk about cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. If you are controlling cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, you are controlling an awful lot of life-sustaining functionality. So you, as future medical care professionals, need to know how the innervation is actually hooked up, right? You need to know how it's wired up to your heart. You need to know how it's wired up to control digestive secretion and digestive contraction and uterine contraction and those kinds of things. So I want to give you the baseline so that you can start to understand this. So it is going to control these effectors, and here's the deal. All of those functionalities, everything from controlling heart rate and respiration and blood pressure and urinary function and reproductive function, all of that kind of stuff, all of that is under involuntary control, right? It's not hooked up to your cerebral cortex. Does that make sense? Like, could you right now, ladies, say, okay, it's a good time for my uterus to contract, and do it? No idea. I can't do anything. And why is that? It's because your cerebral cortex, the part of you that is you, is not hooked up to these functionalities. It's older portions of the brain, like, of course, the diencephalon, the hypothalamus is hooked up for homeostasis. And then the brainstem, yeah? Medulla oblongata, pons, don't those control respiration, right? Heart rate, blood pressure, that kind of stuff. So these old portions of the brain are in control of the autonomic nervous system, so you don't have the capacity to change them much, with the exception of the fact that sometimes your cerebral cortex can override what other portions of your brain are doing. So if you get super stressed out, right, and your heart rate starts to go up, but you decide that you're going to try to calm yourself the hell down, right? You can use your cerebral cortex to try to override what your hypothalamus is telling your heart to do. Does that mean my cerebral cortex can control my heart? No. My cerebral cortex can try its damnedest to control my brain. It's pretty limited in its capacity to do so, though, right? Unless you're a yogi or a CIA operative and you've been working with biofeedback for decades, then you might be able to do it. With me, I can't do it, right? I just can't do it. I'm like, well, apparently you're going to be crazy. Okay, so it's not under conscious control. So the deal is, I want to talk to you guys about the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. So the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, and I want to talk about it by giving you guys a couple of examples. So these figures, when you look at them first, are going to look super confusing, but they're not that bad. So let me show you. Okay, the autonomic nervous system has two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, right? And which one's fight or flight? Sympathetic. And the parasympathetic is feed or breed or rest and digest or whatever you want to call it. What would be happening in my body right now? Which branch of the autonomic nervous system should be activated? Parasympathetic, right? I'm not particularly stressed out from me right now, okay? So what's going to happen is the parasympathetic nervous system is kind of going to be in control. So I want to show you how the parasympathetic nervous system is wired up to the effector organs versus the sympathetic nervous system. So you ready? Okay. This looks terrible. It's not as terrible as it initially looks. So all of these are autonomic effector organs, right? Which means that every single one of these organs has to have cardiac muscle, smooth muscle glands, or some combination in them. Everybody okay with that? Okay. So what I want to talk about is, before we get into the details, I want to talk about what's going on with these right now. So the parasympathetic nervous system is wired up to its effector organs by 4 cranial nerves, okay, and then not a damn thing until you get down to the sacral region of the spinal cord, which is why anatomists often call the parasympathetic nervous system the craniosacral division. Craniosacral? Because they don't care what it does. Anatomists who don't study physiology are absolute bull at phys. And physiologists who don't study anatomy draw all the pictures wrong in the textbook. So it's really funny. Okay, but let me just show you what the other one looks like so you can do comparison contrast, and then we'll do an example. But if we were looking at the sympathetic nervous system and how it was wired up to pretty much the same organs, right? It would actually look like this. The sympathetic nervous system doesn't come from cranial nerves at all, doesn't come from the sacral region, comes from the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. Is that okay? Okay. Do you see it ends up at the same place? Pretty much. Same effector organs? Okay. All right. So with that in mind, do you see how easy it is for you guys to tell which one is which, even in your notes? Right? What's this one? Parasympathetic and? Right. Okay. So those really complicated pictures are not as bad as they initially seem, right? So now I want to do an example, and I want to look at 3 different organs in me under parasympathetic stimulation and under sympathetic stimulation to get you guys started thinking and understanding what they do, okay? So here's the deal. Right now, what is going on in me is probably some level of parasympathetic stimulation to my target organs. But here's what I want you guys to understand. The parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest or feed or breathe or whatever. And so what it's going to do is it's going to go out and send a stimulus to each organ. But what I want you to think about is when things are good, right now, not particularly stressful, do I need that organ to increase or decrease its activity? Is that okay? So for right now, what I want to look at is what's going on with my heart. Okay? So right now, what is going on with my heart? I am going to send parasympathetic innervation to my heart. What do you think it should tell my heart to do? Increase or decrease? Decrease, right? I need it to slow down below what it could do, right? I don't need my heart rate to be 180 beats per minute right now at all. Does that make sense? Let's see what it is. Let's see what it is. It's actually usually pretty high when I'm teaching because I'm spaz. It's actually 93 right now when I'm teaching. It's always high. Okay, so it's telling my heart to slow the hell down, okay? But I want to talk about what it's telling my guts. What do you think it's going to tell the smooth muscle and the glands in my digestive tract? Considering that I ate breakfast too, right? Increase, right? You can increase the activity of the smooth muscle and glands in the digestive tract, right? Okay. And then my uterus. What do you think it's telling my uterus right now? Increase, because I can afford it. I can afford uterine stuff right now, right? I can do uterine contraction if it's necessary. I can build up my endometrium if it's necessary. All of that is cool because I have the resources right now. But now I want you to imagine what's going to happen when my most feared animal walks into the room, which is a freaking polar bear. I'm terrified of polar bears. I don't know how it got here, but that's not part of the story, okay? Polar bear walks into the damn room, and what is going to happen is the same organs are going to turn down parasympathetic stimulation, right? Because shit's going down, right? And what they are going to do is they are going to turn up sympathetic stimulation, okay? So here's what happens when the polar bear runs into the room. Let's just like put it together with some stuff that you've learned. My cerebral cortex identifies it and says, freaking polar bear, right? What it does is tells my medulla oblongata, this is a stressful situation, yes? And then my medulla oblongata is going to send a stimulus down to the thoracic region of the spinal cord, right? And then it's going to send out stimuli to those same three organs. So now I want you to think about what it's going to tell those same three organs. But here's the way you think about it. The way that I think about sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, instead of rote memorizing, think about resource allocation, right? So we have a finite amount of glucose and other nutrients. We have a finite amount of oxygen, yes? Okay, so do you think that the sympathetic nervous system should increase the activity of all organs? No, because you would burn up your resources, right? It should increase the activity of any organ that could potentially help. And what should it do to any other organ? Decrease the activity. Okay, so now let's talk about what's going on. Polar bear walks into the room. I identify it as a freaking polar bear, scared, right? Send the stimulus down to the thoracic region of my spinal cord, and then it's going to come up, right? It's going to go out the thoracic region of my spinal cord, and it's going to go to my heart. You can see how it's getting there, right? We'll talk about the details about the anatomy in just a second. Okay, it's going to go to my heart. It's going to tell my heart to do what? Increase, right? I know you know why, but tell me why. Verbalize why increasing my heart would be worth it. More blood flow, more oxygen, right? More oxygen to your tissues, which you would use for what in your cells?
Cellular respiration.
Your favorite today.
Yeah.
Cellular respiration, yeah. In phys, that's always the damn answer anyway. Cellular respiration. Okay, so you're going to send it, and it's going to increase blood flow, okay? But now let's go to the other two places, right? The sympathetic stimulation is also going to go out to my guts, right? And even though I ate my breakfast, what's it going to tell my guts? Decrease muscular contraction and glandular secretion, right? Because it can't afford them right now, right? And if the polar bear eats me, he can digest my breakfast his damn self, right? Right? He can digest it, okay? All right, and then what is it going to tell my uterus? You're like, we got no time for your nonsense right now. This is not the time to think about sex, right? This is a freaking polar bear in the room, right? So what the sympathetic nervous system does is it does not turn up all organs. It turns up any organ that could be potentially helpful, right? That makes sense? Based on resource allocation. You got finite resources, and so we will figure this out as we look through some examples today. Okay, so you guys got the big picture understanding? Okay, so now sympathetic and the parasympathetic, they both come from the CNS, of course, right? Every innervation comes from the CNS, but they come from different regions. Obviously now you can tell sympathetic from parasympathetic, right? Good? Okay, so let me tell you just a little bit more basic anatomy, and then we will get into some examples to sort of reinforce this for you. So the sympathetic, we always call it the fight or flight division, but it's fight or flight, it's also exercise, and when we teach it, myself included, we always teach extremes. We teach polar bear in the room versus not. But I want you to know that that's not the only time you use your sympathetic nervous system. You're going to use it when you walk to the car, right? You're just going to tweak it for a minute, right? And then as soon as you get in the car and you're driving 45 minutes home, you're going to turn on the parasympathetic again, right? So it's just little bumps and little tweaks most of the time. But people usually understand it better if you teach it in extremes. But I do not want you to think that you never use your sympathetic nervous system unless you're in a car crash or a polar bear, right? You use it little bits all the time, and then you turn it back off. And the parasympathetic is rest and digest or feed or breathe. So that's kind of your baseline one. That's the one that you should assume that you're using most of the time. And then you tweak it with the sympathetic, and then you turn the sympathetic off again, and you tweak it with the sympathetic, turn the sympathetic off again. Good? Okay, so the only other thing anatomically that I want to tell you about the autonomic nervous system is that with the autonomic nervous system, let me just show you this. What we have is, instead of just having one neuron that has its cell body in the central nervous system and goes all the way to the effector, we have a 2-neuron chain in the autonomic nervous system with a ganglion in the middle, which is where you find the cell body of the second neuron. Now, you can look at these, and does it surprise anybody that the neuron cell body, the first one, is in the gray matter of the spinal cord most of the time? It might be in the brainstem too, but this one's showing you spinal cord. But in the gray matter, right? Because this is motor, right? And it's either in the lateral gray horn or it might be a little bit up here, depending on which one you're talking about. Everybody okay with that? Okay. And this first neuron is before the ganglion. The second neuron is in the ganglion. So does it surprise you that we call the first neuron preganglionic and the second neuron postganglionic, right? And you know enough anatomy to see 2 neurons in series and tell which direction the information is going, right? Yeah? Okay, so preganglionic and postganglionic. All right, in phys, you get into the neurotransmitters that involved all over the place, but I want to tell you just anatomically that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are different in the lengths of the preganglionic axon. So let me just introduce this to you. In the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic axons are short and the postganglionic axons are long. Does that mean to you that the ganglion is going to be which one? Closer to the spinal cord or closer to the effector? Spinal cord. Does that make sense? Short pre, long post. So what you will see when you look at the sympathetic nervous system is this. Do you see all of these little chunks right here? They are on either side of the spinal cord, and they are called sympathetic chain, because there's a chain of them, ganglia, or sympathetic trunk ganglia. And they're actually not hard to see if you dissect, but you have to kind of destroy everything to see them. So let me show you where they would be. So if I took a cadaver and I took out everything out of the thoracic cavity, right? So I took all the lungs and the heart and everything out of the mediastinum, then what I could see is a whole bunch of little parallel lumps that were just lateral to the spinal cord, right? Kind of on the anterior surface just by the ribs. These are the sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk ganglia. Does that make sense? So we don't have you learn them on the cadavers, but they're not actually that hard to see. You just like pull the stuff out. You just have to trash the whole thorax in order to see them. And they're going to be on either side, right? Okay, now the difference between that and the parasympathetic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system has long preganglionic and short postganglionic, and that means that the ganglia are going to be close to the effector, sometimes even on the effector. So the pre one is brown and the post one is bluish gray, right? So can you see that the ganglion is actually on the heart, on the lungs, on the liver? Does that make sense? Okay, so conceptually, let me just bring this back to something clinical that you might give a crap about. That means that if I damaged my spinal cord, for instance, would I be more likely to have also damaged sympathetic or parasympathetic ganglia? Sympathetic. However, if I damaged an organ, would I be more likely to have damaged sympathetic or parasympathetic ganglia? Right. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So the pre and the post ganglionic, and they're pretty consistent with your textbook. The pre is always brown and the post is always whatever that color is. I figured out just recently that I see colors differently than other people because I thought that I lived in a gray house, and I figured out a year ago that it's actually green, and everybody knew it but me. Because I don't see blues very well for whatever the hell reason. Like I see them differently than other people. And my family now just like goes around and points at things and asks me what color it is. I'm like, shut up, right? Color's arbitrary. It's just what my cerebral cortex interprets versus yours. Okay, so that's the pre and post. Okay, so now just to put together with a little of fizz, okay? So some of you guys will understand this. The two of you who have had fizz, and then Lauren who's in fizz right now. Is one of you, the rest of you guys in fizz? Anybody else in fizz right now? Okay, how can, just conceptually, the heart respond to the sympathetic innervation and the parasympathetic innervation differently if, for instance, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are hooked up to the same cell? Well, does it make sense to you that you can't actually have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic release the same neurotransmitter on the same cells and cause two different responses? That makes sense? They have to release two different neurotransmitters. Yes? And they do. The sympathetic primarily releases norepinephrine or noradrenaline, okay, which will slow down the heart, but also, speed up the heart, but slow down the uterus, right? Okay. And the sympathetic actually, the parasympathetic actually releases acetylcholine, and acetylcholine has the opposite impact. So the deal is that you can cause two different responses on the same tissue if you release two different neurotransmitters. Good? Okay, so that's how they will actually do that. And you talk about this in a decent amount of detail in Phys, and I'm actually getting to this tomorrow in Phys, so it'll be like perfect timing for you guys to have had both of these. Okay, so the effects of each neurotransmitter can excite or inhibit any tissue, and it primarily depends on the receptors present. All right, so the last thing that we're going to do in this set of notes is just to sort of give you something to grab onto about how the sympathetic and the parasympathetic behave. Okay, so the parasympathetic first. The parasympathetic nervous system sends feed or breathe innervation through 4 cranial nerves, right? And then nothing until you get to the sacral region of your spinal cord. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so since you already learned the cranial nerves, let's put it together with some things that you learned. Now, when we're talking about cranial nerve function here, we're talking all motor, yes? But no skeletal muscles. So we're not interested in controlling the extrinsic eye muscles, right? We're not interested in controlling these muscles here. We're interested in controlling glandular secretion, smooth muscle contraction, and cardiac muscle contraction. Does that make sense? Okay. And a lot of this you've already learned because it was in the tables, but might not have like connected it to anything because you hadn't learned the autonomic nervous system yet. Okay, so we've got 4 cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10. Cranial nerve number 3. Yes, so I want to talk about parasympathetic function, feed or breathe, going through cranial nerve number 3, which is the oculomotor nerve. Yes, so of course it's all motor, the whole thing was motor. And what it is going to do is to control smooth muscle contraction in and near the eye. Yes, and the smooth muscle contraction will control pupil constriction, right? It's going to cause your pupils to constrict. That might not make sense, but it probably should make sense to you that the sympathetic nervous system would cause pupil dilation. Yeah? Polar bear walks in, pupils dilate, right? Because I want to see every polar bear hair before he eats me. Okay? So this controls pupil constriction. It also allows for focusing, right? So most of the time focusing is actually a parasympathetic function, allows for focusing. Everybody good? Okay. So that's the oculomotor nerve. And then we've got the facial nerve. But what does the facial nerve do related to autonomic function? Primarily glandular secretion in your head, nasal glands, lacrimal glands, right? And most of your salivary glands are controlled by the facial nerve. And what do you guys imagine that the parasympathetic nervous system would do to glandular secretion? Increase or decrease it? Increase, yeah, because you can afford it, right? That make sense? Okay, you can afford glandular secretion. And when we're talking about tears, we're not talking about crying. We are talking just about keeping your eyes moist. Okay, all right. And then the glossopharyngeal, which is cranial nerve number 9, controls the other salivary gland that you didn't get before, which is the parotid one, and it increases the activity of the parotid gland. Good? And then this big honker right here, cranial nerve number 10, you should know its name. What's its name? Vagus nerve. Why is it called vagus? Because it wanders like a vagrant all the way down into areas that you don't think it has any business going into. But look what it does. It's really freaking busy. The vagus nerve does almost all of the organs of the ventral body cavity until you get to the pelvic region, right? So look what it's going to do. And it's going to do what? Parasympathetic or sympathetic function of these? Parasympathetic. So normal feeder breed functionality. So let's go back again and talk about what's going on with parasympathetic function. So what is going on with my heart right now, right, is the cerebral cortex is saying everything's cool. It's telling my medulla oblongata that this is time that you need to slow down your heart rate, right? And what it's going to do is the medulla oblongata is going to send out a signal through cranial nerve number 10. There's two of them. They're paired, right? And they are going to go to my heart, and they are going to tell it to chill, right? Slow it down, right? So that's how that's happening right now in me and in you. It's coming through cranial nerve number 10. But through cranial nerve number 10, they are also telling my digestive tract to do what? To increase. And they're telling my uterus to, oh, not through the uterus. We won't do uterus yet because uterus comes from down here. So they're telling different things depending on whether you need to increase or decrease an organ with parasympathetic innervation. So what does cranial nerve number 10 do? It does most of the autonomic function of the entire ventral body cavity until you get down to the pelvic cavity, right? And then let's talk about what you get from the sacral region of the spinal cord. And this is interesting because we can think about spinal cord injuries here. So S2 through S4, these sacral spinal nerves that leave right down there, all the way down at the bottom, look what they innervate. Parasympathetic functionality of the distal end of the digestive tract, right? Including the descending and sigmoid colon and the rectum. Urinary bladder, right? Penis or clitoris, depending on what you got, uterus and vagina, right? But please note that the testes and the ovaries were actually taken care of by the vagus nerve. Okay, so what are they going to do? What do you think to here? What do you think they're going to do here? They're going to allow for contraction to keep things moving through the distal end. What do you think they're going to do to your urinary bladder? Urinary bladder contraction to get the urine out, right, when you can afford it. How about the uterus and the vagina? That's fine to use those now, right? If you got a reason to, you can use them now because you can afford it. And the penis and the clitoris, right? They can send blood there if it's an appropriate time to do so, right? It's fine, right? So you can use those now. So now I want to talk about spinal cord injuries. When you have a person with a spinal cord injury, even if they have a relatively low spinal cord injury, like L1, L2 or whatever, right? What functionality is actually going to be most likely to be lost? Sympathetic functionality or parasympathetic functionality? Parasympathetic functionality because it comes from the sacral region of the spinal cord, right? And how does that manifest in people with spinal cord injuries, even if they're very, very high functioning paraplegic? How does it manifest with defecation? Yeah, loss of control. Now, sometimes they can train themselves to the point that they can control it with like the skeletal muscles that are still innervated, right? And they can time their defecation so that it works relatively well for them. Loss of control of urination. Again, depending on how much loss they have, they can either end up with a catheter or they can time their urination, right? They can do that as well. How about uterus and vagina functions? Can do muscular contraction, but could this woman be pregnant if she was damaged? Yeah, because this actually, ovulation and hormone secretion is controlled further up. Does that make sense? Okay. And how about males? Can they get erections? Sometimes, but it's not directly related to this motor functionality, but there's a whole bunch of different things like hormonal activity can cause it. And also sometimes you can actually get a penis pump implanted if you need to have one after a spinal cord injury. So do not assume that like there is absolutely no reproductive functionality, because that's definitely not the truth, and there's lots of variation. Okay, so this is all parasympathetic functionality. You kind of understand what's going on with parasympathetic functionality, and we'll talk about sex right before we get it to the heart, because it's kind of interesting what's going on with like sex. Okay, so I want to talk about sympathetic functionality now, right? And all sympathetic functionality comes through the thoracic region of the spinal cord and L1 and L2, so the thoracolumbar. So what does the sympathetic nervous system do to different organs? This is where you just start thinking about resource allocation. And usually it does exactly the opposite of what the parasympathetic nervous system does. So even if we don't talk about it specifically, what do you think it would do to, for instance, salivary gland secretion? Decrease it, right? Because I've got finite resources and I can't afford that. You have experienced that before. Have you ever been in a bad job interview or a really uncomfortable conversation or a bad date? What happens to your salivary gland secretion? You got nothing, right? Nothing. Your whole mouth is stuck together. What happens to your pupils? They dilate like crazy, right? You're like, this is going well, right? And then what happens to your heart? Increased cardiac muscle contraction, because a person who's in front of you, your body doesn't know it's not a polar bear, right? Your body behaves the same to physical stresses as it does to emotional stresses. You have one stress response, it's a one-trick pony, it reacts the same for car crashes, polar bears, and bad job interviews. And for that matter, it also reacts the same to positive stresses. When you are really, really attracted to someone, that's called a eustress situation. And you can have all of these things happen. Not particularly helpful, that your pupils dilate, your mouth dries up, your heart rate goes up. Then it heats up your body and you start to sweat like a pig. That's fantastic. I'm sure that's going to go over well. So it increases the activity of, for instance, your heart, causes vasoconstriction of most of your vessels simply because of resource allocation, right? So I'm going to basically save most of my blood to send it to a few places, right? Skeletal muscles, because freaking polar bear, right? Heart, brain, and lungs. And everything else can suck it, and that ends up increasing your blood pressure. Good? It also causes dilation of the bronchioles. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah? More air in. It doesn't really impact the diaphragm because it can't, because the diaphragm is somatic innervation, but it does actually impact what's going on to the lungs. It inhibits the activity of your digestive glands and your organs. And if you guys have ever almost been in a car accident, you've probably experienced this. If you almost ever been on I-15 and almost die, and then you don't die, and your digestive system shuts down, but then as soon as you figure out you're going to live, it turns all on at the same time, and you might have to buy new pants. And that is not pleasant because you already had a bad day, okay? Stimulates your sweat glands, not because that's helpful, but because usually the sympathetic nervous system heats up the body, right? And then your sweat glands will turn on. And then the other thing that's interesting is that the sympathetic nervous system is hooked up to the adrenal glands, specifically to the adrenal medulla. And so what happens is, if necessary, you're going to dump a whole bunch of that neurotransmitter-like chemical called adrenaline or epinephrine into the bloodstream. Why would you do this? Well, if a polar bear walks into the room, then you activate massive sympathetic nervous system response, right? Not just like I got scared when I went around a corner, but it's friggin' polar bear. And it's really expensive to stimulate your heart over and over and over again. It's actually cheaper to take something that's neurotransmitter-like and dump it into the bloodstream as adrenaline or epinephrine, and it gets to the same target organs through the bloodstream as it would as a neurotransmitter. And it enhances and prolongs the fight or flight response in a cheaper way than repeated activation with the nervous system. But it matters because then once you dump it into the bloodstream, you can't undo it until it actually gets cleared out of the bloodstream, right? So if you almost got into a car accident that was bad enough that you almost had to buy new pants, what happens is you dump a whole bunch of adrenaline or epinephrine into your bloodstream, and you can't actually calm down until it's gone, right? You can't. Your heart rate will not immediately go down. Your pupils are not going to constrict back. You can't control your respiration rate. And you can't do any of that until it clears out of your bloodstream. This is why if you've ever gotten into a situation like you're super primed to have an argument with your significant other, right? You're like, I have my whole PowerPoint of how you piss me off together, and I would like to discuss this. And I go up to my husband and I'm like, Mike, I want to talk to you about something. This thing that you did, it really pissed me off because of A, B, and C. You see right here on the document. And then he does what he quite often does, and he's like, oh, you're totally right. That wasn't very considerate. I'm sorry, Mel. And then I'm like, What the hell just happened? And what do? My adrenaline makes me keep talking. And I'm like, I don't really like your tone, dude. I don't even know what the hell's going on with you. When what I need to do is go take a damn walk, right? And let that stuff clear out of my bloodstream. Those of us who are parents know that it's really important when you're dealing with your kids. If they get into full-blown flip-out mode, you need to realize that they cannot calm down until the adrenaline clears from their system. It doesn't mean they have to act like a little jackass, but it means that they have a lot of adrenaline going through the system, and you might need to let them find a place where it's appropriate to be crazy, right? You need to go punch a pillow and not your dog and not your sister, and you can't talk to me that way, but you can go to town on that pillow, right? Okay, you come back out when you're done, right? And you can yell at them to calm down, but they can't, right? The adrenaline is coursing through their system, and it's going to take a minute before everything actually calms down. It has some interesting effects on your brain as well. So this is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the only other thing that's really interesting is how these are related to sex. Because this is counterintuitive. I don't understand why the hell it works this way. But here's the deal. With which one do you think, which branch, is hospitable, friendly to arousal and erection? Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Parasympathetic, yes. Parasympathetic is friendly to arousal and erection. Okay? And both sexes, by the way, get erections if you're doing it right. You might not notice hers, but you should go looking for it because it will benefit you both in the long run. Okay? So what happens is with whatever kind of stimulation works for you and parasympathetic innervation, right? Parasympathetic innervation, what it allows for is dilation of the blood vessels that leads to your junk, right? Right? Dilation of the arterioles and the blood vessels that leads to your junk, which increases blood flow, which can allow for erection in both, right? That makes sense? Erection and arousal. Also, the increased blood flow increases sensory stimulation in the area as well. Everybody good with that? Okay. Now, sympathetic stimulation is inhospitable to arousal and erection because it does the opposite. It causes constriction of the arterioles that lead to your junk. Does that make sense to you? And it makes sense with what you've heard, right? With stress and erections and erectile dysfunction. And I know we always talk about erectile dysfunction in men, but that's only because the erection in a male is necessary for intercourse. Women also have erectile dysfunction, yes, but nobody notices because you can still have sex. And I would like to talk to the management about why that is true, right? Really, it should be both of them have an erection before anything functions. But no, you can have, you can even get knocked up. Not even be into it at all. I would like to speak to the management. Okay, so sympathetic stimulation is inhospitable to erection, but the interesting thing is that it is parasympathetic stimulation that allows you for the arousal and plateau stages of sex, but guess what actually causes orgasm and ejaculation? It's sympathetic stimulation. Yeah, so you gotta get them really calm, really calm. Sarah, don't do that. No, that's not at all how it works. Some of you guys who are like 17, they're like, is that how it works? No. Don't do that. Okay, all right, so that's it with the autonomic nervous system, and then we will get into the heart. The heart is not hard. So what I want to do with our time today is start out by talking about, instead of memorizing heart parts at first, I want to talk about the logic of the heart. Because in my experience, and maybe you guys have had the same experience, maybe not. First off, if you learned any anatomy in any class before this, you're very likely to have learned cardiovascular anatomy, the heart specifically. And for some reason it sticks, right? You tend to retain quite a bit of it. Like you remember atrias versus ventricles, you remember all of that kind of stuff. And I think that that's because it's relatively logical. It actually has a decent amount of logic to it. It's not, you know, like trying to put the freaking pictures of the brain together and trying to figure out what the hell you're looking at. So this is how your textbook actually represents the sort of plan of the heart. This is like a functional diagram. It's not an anatomical diagram correctly, but I want to do it even more simply than that. I want to start with a super simple box diagram to understand the functionality of the heart, okay? And then after we understand the functionality of the heart, Then we'll start to put in the details. So we're going to look at forests first, and then we're going to look at trees. So I know that you have heard many times that the heart is a pump, but I would argue that it's actually two pumps that are side by side. And the left heart does something different than the right heart. They don't directly communicate with one another at all in a healthy adult. They will ultimately deliver to one another, but not directly to one another. In a healthy adult, there's no direct connection between the left and the right side. So what I want to do to get started is to draw a super, super, super simple picture of the heart. And I want to start to figure out why it works the way that it works before we actually get into details. So we're just going to do a box diagram first. And then we'll come back to this one when we get done. Okay, so we're going to do a box diagram with 4 chambers. Okay, and you already know. So we're going to look at it like we're looking at a patient. And so this is the left side and this is the right side. Okay, so the top 2 chambers are called what collectively? Atria. So this is the left atrium and this is the right atrium. And the bottom chambers are called what?
Ventricles.
Yeah. So this is the left ventricle, right ventricle. The ventricles are bigger than the atria. They're also going to be way more muscular. Now I want to tell you guys, since some of you guys are going to have your lab before I see you next, and some of you already had it, I bought a whole bunch of fresh pig hearts from the butcher for you guys because pig hearts are super duper similar to human hearts. They're so similar that that's what surgeons practice on. And they're fresh so you can see the actual textures of the heart. I really, really want to encourage you to either be involved in the dissection of the pig heart or if you don't get involved in the dissection, touch it afterward. Feel the difference in thickness between the atria and the ventricles. Put your fingers, with gloves on, right, through the valves and show yourself which way they open and close. We also have preserved hearts, but the preserved hearts are kind of like a preserved brain. They give you like an improper assumption about the actual texture. What you will see with the actual fresh hearts is that the atria are super duper soft. They're not thick at all. They're really flappy. They kind of feel like skin, right? But the ventricles are really thick and muscular, especially the left one. So put your fingers in there. And we also have some preserved hearts. So if you want to do a dissection of that one, you're welcome to do that too. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start this story at an arbitrary place. It's 2 different circles. So you can start anywhere, but I'm going to start right here, okay? I'm going to start at the left ventricle. I'm going to tell you some things as we go through. This is a functional diagram. This is not actually where it leaves right there, but that makes it a very hard picture to draw, okay? So the left ventricle is going to have a valve to be named later. Talk about it later. And every ventricle, the ventricles are primarily pumping chambers, right? So the ventricles really pump. So every vessel that is attached to a ventricle is going to be carrying blood away from the heart, okay? Because the ventricles are the pumping chambers. Do you know what you call a vessel that carries blood away from the heart? What do you call it?
Vessel.
Be more specific. Artery. Yes. Now, here's what happened to most of us. Somebody taught you at some point in your life that an artery carried oxygenated blood and a vein carried deoxygenated blood, and that's not what those are named for. An artery is defined by one thing and one thing only. It carries blood away from the heart, regardless of the gas content of the artery, because we will meet some deoxygenated arteries. And we will talk today about why the hell people tell you that when it's actually not true, and you'll figure out why they told you. Okay, so the artery is going to carry blood away from the heart. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the gas content of the blood, and then we're going to talk about where it should be headed. The blood that is leaving the left ventricle has high oxygen, low CO2. So that's rich, juicy blood. I'm going to give you 2 choices. Should I send that blood to the lungs or anywhere else? Nope, I don't need to send it to the lungs because it's already got high oxygen, low carbon dioxide. I can send it to any other organ, right? That makes sense? It can go to any other organ. Collectively, you call every organ but the lungs, you call these the systemic organs. And specifically, I'm going to send it to the systemic capillaries. So here's where this blood is going to go. Systemic capillaries. Now, all the capillaries are not below the heart like that. I'm just trying to oversimplify the story. So, here's what you guys need to understand about capillaries. Capillaries are the only place that is thin enough and branched enough for gas and nutrient and waste exchange to go on. So I'm never going to change gas content unless I go through a capillary bed. But as I go through this capillary bed, guys, and come out the other side, this might be the capillary bed of the digestive tract or the brain, right? What is going to happen as I go through that capillary bed? Because the cells are doing what? One more time? Cellular respiration. They are going to gobble up the oxygen, yes, and they are going to generate a whole bunch of CO2. So the blood on the other side of the systemic capillary bed is what gas content? Low oxygen, high CO2. Does that make sense to everybody? This blood is pretty much useless, right? So what's the only logical place to send it? To the lungs, but it doesn't have enough pressure to get to the lungs fast enough, so I have to send it back to the heart to give it a pressure bump. So I'm going to send it back. The atria are not really pumping chambers. They do a little pumping, but not much. They're mostly receiving chambers. Okay. This vessel right here is delivering blood back to the heart. And that means it's not an artery, it is a vein. Veins are described as delivering blood back to the heart. Does that make sense? Okay. You're going to go into the right atrium. There is a valve right here, to be named later. Right atrium to right ventricle. I will never change gas content as I go through the heart chambers because that's not a capillary bed. Everybody okay with that? So if you went in low oxygen, you're coming right back out low oxygen. So I'm going to leave. Again, that's not the anatomical location for this, but I'm going to put it right here. Valve to be named later. Good. And it is going to go where? I bet I don't have to tell you. Yeah, it's going to go to the lungs. Yes? Okay. Specifically, I am going to send it to what I call the pulmonary capillaries. Right? And that should tell you that gas content or gas exchange is going to go on. So here's the deal. I know that this is logical and makes sense to you, but I'm going to over-explain it. Okay? As I go through the pulmonary capillary beds, here's the deal that's going to happen with the pulmonary capillary beds. I'm delivering blood to the lungs that is low oxygen, high carbon dioxide. I'm breathing in air that is what? High oxygen, low carbon dioxide. What is going to happen is the carbon dioxide is going to move from my blood into the air, yes? And the oxygen is going to move from the air into my blood. Yes? Okay? And then as I go through those capillary beds, the blood on the other side is going to be what gas content? NO2, low CO2. That's rich, juicy blood again, yes? Okay? I can send that anywhere in the body except the lungs, but I need to bump up the pressure. So I'm going to send it where first? Back to the heart. Again, the atria are receiving chambers. Send it back into the left side of the heart. Go through a valve to be named later. Back to the left ventricle. Start the whole damn thing again. Does that make sense? So, with this in mind, what I want to tell you is as we get into vessels, which we will get into after your test on Tuesday, as we get into vessels, when you guys take vessel tests from me or quizzes, I'm not just going to ask you what this artery is called, because if you're conscious, you'll probably guess it's the brachial artery, right? The one that's running right through there, right? But I will ask you the gas content of any vessel anytime, right? And could you figure out what the brachial artery probably had as gas content? High oxygen, low carbon dioxide. And I'll probably ask you which direction blood is flowing through that artery too. So if it's coming from the heart, it's probably going down, right? So what we are going to use this as is a logic tool to help you keep from rote memorization, right? Think about every single time you look at blood flow, you look at it as a story, right? You don't look at it as that vessel's called that, and that vessel's called that, and that vessel's called that. Because once you learn it's a story, it's really, really hard to lose it, right? When you memorize something, it goes really quickly. When you learn a narrative, it actually stays quite a bit longer. So we'll work on that when we get to the next set of notes. Okay, so let's talk about the mistake. Oh, we didn't put the gas content in this one. So we went from the right atrium to the right ventricle. We didn't change gas content, so this one would still be low oxygen, high carbon dioxide. Okay, so let's talk about why, in all likelihood, you had a middle school teacher who taught you that arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. When this vessel right here, this one right here, carrying blood away from the heart, isn't this an artery? Isn't it? Yeah? But it's low oxygen. Okay? So why would you have a middle school teacher who taught you that arteries carry oxygenated blood? This one right here.
Because it's a pretty short pathway from the right
Yeah,
ventricle to
because
the
most of the arteries in your body do carry oxygenated blood, right? Because there's way more of them that go to a whole bunch of organs and all of your skeletal muscles, right? That makes sense? And there's only a few that actually go to your lungs. So most of your arteries are oxygenated. She was right, or he was right, yes? But could you live without the arteries that carry blood from your heart to your lungs? No, right? So an artery is defined as carrying blood away from the heart, and a vein is defined as carrying blood back to the heart. So A for arteries away, this is how I teach the middle schoolers. A for arteries away, B for veins back. And they don't forget it. They're like taking their test and going, A for arteries away, B for veins back. Okay, so let's talk about the circuits. What we have just demonstrated is that they're actually not one circuit, but two, and they kind of interlock. Do you see this one going from here back to here? Yeah? This one is going through systemic capillary beds. Starts from one chamber, ends in another. This is called the systemic circuit. Starts from what chamber? Left ventricle. Goes back to what chamber? Right atrium. Yes? Okay. And then you have another circuit. This circuit right here starts in a chamber, ends in a chamber, goes through the pulmonary capillary beds. This one is called the pulmonary circuit. Starts in what chamber? Right ventricle. Ends in left atrium. Right? So concept check question for you. What I told you guys before is that I would argue that the heart is two pumps, not one pump. Because the actual two sides of the heart actually carry two different kinds of blood. Which side of your heart in a healthy person will always have oxygenated blood in it?
Left.
The left side always has oxygenated blood. And the right side always has deoxygenated blood. Yes? And should they mix? No, not in a healthy adult. That would distinctly compromise your functionality, right? If you were mixing high and low oxygen blood, right? Now, every once in a while, you will have a person who has a hole in their heart, usually right here for reasons we'll describe a little bit later, and that person's heart would have to compensate for the fact that the blood was mixing, right? And it's a little hard on your heart for that to happen. And a lot of times they'll go in and actually surgically fix it if they need to. Everybody okay? Okay, so let's talk systemic and pulmonary circuit. We've got those. Let's just talk briefly about the different kinds of vessels. We actually cover this in more detail in the next set of notes. But what makes an artery, and how do you tell one when you see it in a cadaver or in a person? Can you see that arteries are going to be way higher pressure than veins because they're directly attached to the pumping portion of the heart? Does that make sense to you? Yeah? Okay. So they're going to be way higher pressure. Because they're way higher pressure, they need two things. First off, they've got more muscle in their wall, okay? A thicker muscle to give them some structural stability. They also receive blood in squirts, not trickles, right? Because when the ventricle contracts, it's going to push a squirt of blood into the artery. So they actually have to have more elasticity in their wall too, right? So they have to be structurally stable and they have to have some snapback, right? Okay. For that reason, when you look at an artery versus a vein in a cadaver or in a human, in a living human, arteries stand up. They stay up. So if I was looking at two vessels that were running through this region, I could identify the brachial artery from the brachial vein because the brachial artery will stand up and stay relatively round, and the brachial vein, which is way lower pressure, yes, further away from the heart, other reasons it's lower pressure as well. The brachial vein is going to be way lower pressure, further away from the pump, right, on its way back. It's going to be thinner walled and it's not very elastic. So if you looked at the difference, the artery would stand up and the vein would collapse. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so you'll be able to tell the difference between them. Arteries are usually easier to find because they're nice and round and stand up. Good? Okay, so.
Thin and more flat. Thin and more flat.
Yeah, if it's empty. You know, in you, they're not empty, right? But if you're looking at a cadaver, it's empty. The artery is empty too, but it's still going to stand up because it's got all that elasticity and muscular, right? Okay, so arteries are going to take blood away from the heart, as we said. The arteries in the systemic circuit are oxygenated, but the arteries in the pulmonary circuit are deoxygenated. And of course, there's a hell of a lot of these, right? Most of your arteries that you're going to name are actually going to be in the systemic circuit. The smaller arteries, when they get barely visible with the naked eye, they're super variable from person to person, and we call them arterioles. You never have to learn them by name because they're too variable between two people to learn them by name. But if they're on their way to a capillary bed, arteries are going to be big and then branch and get smaller, right? And right before the capillary bed, they're going to be little bitty, right? Barely visible with the naked eye. Capillaries are microscopic, smallest diameter, most branched. This is where all of the gas and nutrient and waste exchange occurs. Everything else is too thick for it to occur there. Interestingly, although it sounds absolutely ridiculous now because we know and we have microscopy, there were thousands of years in which we did not know that that capillaries existed. Believe it or not, what they thought was, I can see the blood going this way and I can see the blood coming this way. They just thought that blood sloshed onto an organ and then sloshed back. They had no idea that it was actually connected via the microscopic tubes of the capillaries. And this was brilliant people, right? They had no idea, right? It was only like in the 1800s that we got any microscopy at all, right? And then in the 1800s, still everybody argued that just because you can see it through this magic box, it doesn't mean it actually exists, right? And they argued against the function of capillaries and they argued against the existence of germs for about 50 years. You couldn't even get doctors to wash their damn hands because they're like, what are you trying to say about me? You're trying to say I'm dirty, right? Why would you say that? And who are you? And shut up, little lady. Capillaries, the whole like capillary idea took a long time for people to actually accept it. But now we know that they exist and they're really the point of all of it. And then as you're working your way back from capillaries, you get into these little bitty veins that are barely visible with the naked eye. You don't have to know them by name. They're called venules. And then they join to become bigger veins. A vein is defined as carrying blood back to the heart. There's way more variability and about 3 times as many veins as there are arteries. And we will talk about that in more detail later, but it's kind of interesting. Anybody have any idea why evolutionarily, in humans and any other mammal that you want to talk about, and probably in reptiles and birds as well, evolutionarily, there would be more pressure on artery variation than there is on venous variation. Any idea why? Why variability was sort of less tolerated evolutionarily in arteries than it is in veins? Think about it this way. What? It's not the size of the heart, it's where it's going. So
you need to take more waste away quicker.
So arteries are on their way to work. Can you think of them that way, right? And think about you on your way to work, right? If you're like me, you're always within 5 minutes of being late, right? Always, right? You're like, if anything happens, I'm definitely going to be late. Anything, right? I don't know what the hell is my problem. I'm a grown-ass woman, but I'm always like, just making it, okay? So they're on their way to work. If, for instance, you developed, right, 5 more branches on your way to work, right? Can you see that there might be selective pressure against him being successful if he went a really circuitous route on his way to a capillary bed? But veins are on their way back from work, right? And if you developed 5 extra ones, but you're just freaking farting around on your way back to the heart, right? And veins can actually be pretty slow, right? It's totally fine. You're gonna ditch your job. You're gonna go to Target, right? Buy 72 things that you didn't need, and you're gonna do it by your damn self because you're a mom, right? And be like, I'm gonna stay here. I don't need 2 hours worth of Target, right? But what's gonna happen when you get home is somebody's gonna make you cook something. That's what's gonna happen. There's always somebody hungry there. It's like the worst. Kids eat so often. Moms, right? It's just ridiculous. You literally just fed the little asses. What happened is arterial variation is really selected against. You have to get there and you have to get there quickly. But venous variation, there was very little selection against. So we have way more variability. For instance, if we looked at my arm versus your arm, or we're the same sex, if we looked at my arm versus her arm, it's very likely that we have different branch points in our veins. And so you might even have a couple extra veins compared to me, and it's fine. Because there was really no evolutionary pressure against venous variation. So we end up with about 3 times as many veins as arteries and a whole bunch of variation. So the picture that is in your textbook of the veins is just like, well, kinda. But the picture that's in the textbook of the arteries is usually right. So veins are actually going to carry blood back to the heart. Basically, almost all of your systemic veins are going to dump into a couple of big vessels. If you've already been to lab this week, you know that anything above your heart dumps into a big vessel called the superior vena cava, and anything from below your heart dumps into a big vessel called the inferior vena cava, and they both dump into the right atrium, right? So it's all going to sort of go all the way back. Everybody good? Okay, so let me tell you what we're going to do next time. Next time we will actually look at all the specific anatomy of the heart, but since that's our last lecture before your test, do you think you're going to be more comfortable if you prepare before lecture? You are, right? You're going to be way, way more comfortable if you prepare before lecture, because I will finish this set of notes if it kills all of us, right? Okay, but it's just hard. It's not that bad. Okay, so, and then I told the other class I was going to, but I'm not going to give you guys a quiz on Thursday. I'm going to give you a take-home quiz over the weekend as like to help you study.
Yeah.
See you guys.